I want to start with a story that appears right at the beginning of this book, which you could call Adventures in Babysitting, which isn't the 1987 Elizabeth Shue film, but it's sort of 9 years before that, how this story came about, how this film came about.
Well, it was an extraordinary thing. I had a babysitter. I had two young sons. And my babysitter, I was working as an assistant director in Hollywood and working on a film with Mel Brooks at the time. And my babysitter asked me if, she said, well, my boyfriend wrote a script and I wondered if you'd read it. Now, everybody has a script in Hollywood, and if they don't have a script, they have a headshot. I mean, but they're going to have, they'll have a picture of themselves and they want to be actors or they want to be writers. So, I had heard this before, but I wasn't so jaded that I didn't think. I said, okay, I'll read it. And I put it in my drawer. I didn't think about it. And I went off. I worked for a couple of weeks. And one day, she was no longer working for us at that time because she had gotten a better job. And I pulled the script out of the drawer and saw it. And it was The Elephant Man. I mean, I didn't know what it was, but I read it. And immediately after finishing the script, it was 200 pages long. I mean, it was a heavy script. But I loved the story, and I immediately called her up and I said, well, wait a minute. You said your boyfriend wrote this. She said, yeah, my boyfriend and his friend, they wrote it together. So I immediately got their number and invited them over to my house. And that was the beginning of the process of me trying to option it, deciding that this was the movie that I wanted to make my debut as a producer on. I mean, I knew nothing about the process of what it would take to get a movie like this made, but I liked the story and I thought it was an amazing story, and so I decided to take it on. And the writers, of course, were thrilled. They were concerned because in Hollywood, as in many places, it's not unknown for someone to take a script and then get rid of the writers and find somebody else and stuff like that. And they wanted to be sure that they were going to be part of it. I said, no, absolutely. You guys will be part of the movie as long as, if I can get it made, you're with me all the way. And in fact, they're actually in the movie. There's a scene very, very much at the opening, early part of the movie where you see Anthony Hopkins walking through, looking for the Elephant Man when he's going, back in the docklands.
Yep.
And he comes upon two guys who are playing an odd-looking musical instrument, which David Lynch actually created and we built. And the two guys behind it were the two writers of the movie. It was great.
So one of the things that fascinates me about the journey of the making of this film is the moment that you, Mel Brooks, and David Lynch were first in a room together, because that's a fascinating combination of people that most people wouldn't think would result in a film like this.
Well, I agree. It certainly was, but it was pretty much a serendipitous kind of a meeting, because there was no normal reason for us all to be together, except for the fact that I had been working for Mel Brooks as an assistant director. I had told him that I had optioned a script, and he read the script. This was weeks before David Lynch was involved. Maybe even months before, probably, but not that much more. And he had read it, and he called me up and he said, look, I want to start a company to make movies other than my own comedies, and I love this story, and where did you find it? Well, and I kind of gave him a little bit of the history, and he said, well, I trust you, we work together, you can produce it, and that was it. I mean, he gave me his imprimatur. He said, I know you can do it. And the next thing that happened was I had met David Lynch independently because I had seen Eraserhead, which he had just finished, and he had done Eraserhead. And a friend of mine, Stuart Kornfeld, had introduced me to David because he'd seen the movie, and it had nothing to do with Elephant Man. It was just a situation where I said, I got to meet the guy who made this crazy movie. So he said, well, I'll give you his number. And he gives me David's number, and we called and we decided we'd have coffee together. We met for coffee, and we just talked. And there was something about him that I immediately gravitated towards, because he's a very engaging, lovely man. And I asked him what he was doing, and he told me about a script that he was writing called Ronnie Rocket at the time, and he asked me what I was doing, and I said, well, I have this script called Elephant Man I'm trying to get made. And he said, oh, Elephant Man, I like the sound of that. So he said, could I read it? So I said, yeah, sure, why not? So we exchanged scripts, and I sent him, or I gave him a copy of Elephant Man, and he gave me a copy of his script. Literally, the next day, he called me up and he said, I love this story. Would you consider me directing it? And it was one of those weird moments where I didn't have a director. I didn't have anybody obvious. I was obviously hoping to get some major Hollywood director at the time, and I was thinking of people like Alan Pakula or somebody like that. But I really didn't have anybody, and so I said, well, let's meet again. And we sat down and we talked about it, and he started telling me about how he saw the movie. And I liked what he said very much. I really, really thought he was really smart. He had great ideas. He had changes that he wanted. He thought he needed to collapse it. He wanted to work with the writers if he could meet them. And I agreed. So I said, but look, I have a benefactor. It's Mel Brooks, and he's gonna have something to say about this. So I got to convince him that this is a good idea. And he said, fine. He understood that. So the next thing I did was I went to Mel and I said, look, Mel, I met this guy. I think he's really interesting. He said, well, what's he directed? And I said, well, he directed this movie called Eraserhead. He said, well, let me see it. So, okay, I called David up. We get a print of Eraserhead. Mel's office is at 20th Century Fox. We put it on in the screening room there one afternoon. I hadn't even thought about the consequences of this moment, but I'm sitting in a room alone. Mel Brooks is sitting behind me. I'm sitting in front of him, and the room goes black, light goes on, and we're watching Eraserhead. Now, I've already seen it. The second time you see Eraserhead, it's the longest movie in the history of movies. Yeah. I'm waiting for every moment to pass, and I'm thinking, the man behind me thinks I'm out of my mind. I know he thinks I'm crazy. How could I think this guy? I'm trying to come up with a story that I'm going to tell him at the end of the movie when he hits me in the head and says, "What are you thinking? How could that guy do?" And I know Mel a little bit, so I'm thinking that's what he's going to do. So, and I'm sitting there literally in a flop sweat. I am just sitting there, just waiting for it to be over. The movie is over. Lights go down. The lights come up. Movie's off, and I'm afraid to turn around because I know I'm gonna face something very, very painful. And I slowly turn around and I look at Mel, and he's sitting there and he's nodding his head. I said, "What did you think?" And he said, "I get it. It's an adolescent's nightmare of responsibility." I said, "Wow, no one ever said that. It was like." He says, "I really like that." He said, let's meet the guys. So I called up David. David wouldn't come to the screening, by the way. He was too nervous to be in the room when Mel watched it. So I called David up. David comes down to the studio, and he's wearing a little bomber jacket, his shirt buttoned up to the top. He's got a pocket protector and pencils in it. And this is David's outfit, all the time. And chino pants and trainers, and basically Mel looks at him and says, "You're a madman." He says, "I love it. Let's do it." And we all talked. I couldn't believe it, but Mel was all for it. He believed in it. He believed in David and my judgment of David, and that was how it began. And the next time somebody had asked Mel, and obviously many of you probably heard this, but they asked Mel what he thought of David Lynch soon after that, and why, what he was like. And he said David Lynch is like Jimmy Stewart, if Jimmy Stewart had been born on the planet Venus. And that was the perfect description of who David was at that time, and probably who he still is. I think John Hurt was unbelievably he was amazing in his ability to take what it took to have to go through this, because the process of once he had the makeup on a given day, And we got it down to a maybe 5.5 to 6 hours. So he would come in at 6 in the morning. The makeup would be ready by noon, and I'd have the crew come in at noon, and we'd work straight through till 10 o'clock at night. So we didn't stop. Once he was in the makeup, we wanted to get through as much work as we could in any given day, and we only worked on the days that he had the makeup. Those weeks, we only worked every other day because he couldn't have it on his face 2 days in a row. It was just too much. So we would work one day we'd work 10 hours, and then we'd only rehearse the next day without the makeup, and then the day after that, we'd come back and do this again. What was so interesting about it was that the crew had only seen John as the Elephant Man, because by the time they came in, he was already in makeup. When they left at the end of the day, he was still in makeup. He couldn't eat normally during the day because of what he had on. He could drink through a straw, but that was it. So on those days, he would, and he almost had to sit up straight. I mean, it was a very painful. John had mentioned. He said at one point, I think I mentioned it in the book. He said, I never thought anybody could take away the pleasure of working in a movie, but you guys have done it, But no, but he was extraordinarily gracious also, and he had developed a real good bond with Chris, and the work that he put in, and the way he did it, I felt was extraordinary from day one. And it was a situation where, people had said to me, well, since you can't see John Hurt, anybody could do that. And I said, really? Well, I watched him, and one of the first days we worked with him in the makeup was a day when he comes into the hospital and he walks across the floor in the room, and he comes to meet Dr. Treves. And when I saw him do that walk, I knew it could only have been John Hurt. It could only have been a magnificent actor who understood both the posture and the body and everything else that he had to do to make that work. In addition to that, he had a prosthetic piece in his mouth, which obstructed his ability to speak, but John has a great ability to get past all of that, and he did a magnificent job. And one of the things, those of you who know about making movies, you know that you sometimes you dub at the end of the movie, and our sound people wanted to come in and said, well, we'll clean up all the dialogue because we can't really understand him all the time. And David and John and I we all got together and we said, no, we don't really want to do that, because that's the nature of who he is. I mean, if we try to clean it up, it's going to be sanitizing the way he, it should be difficult to hear what he says, because that is the way it would have been. So we decided not to do any extra dubbing or adding, a cleaner voice track after the fact. But anyway, we were talking about John Hurt, and he was extraordinary every day that he worked.
And it is that thing, Christopher's work notwithstanding, and the physical performance, it's the ability with seeing so little of his face to convey such emotion and compassion is quite extraordinary.
I totally agree. I believe we did, actually, because, and I think John did more than anyone. I mean, I think, John embodied what we imagined the character to have been, what the man to have been. And we all had, it was interesting working in that space. When you're imagining a character who's based on a real, a living, breathing man. One of the aspects of that was that when Chris was designing the makeup, he asked David and I if we could get, there's a bust of the real man, of Joseph Merrick, in the London Hospital Museum, at the London Hospital. And David and I went down to the London Hospital, and we became relatively friendly with the curator of this museum. And it was a museum of oddities, and not just the Elephant Man, but other oddities that had come through the museum. And Chris said, well, do you think you can get the bust of the Elephant Man? And there's only one. And if we dropped it, it's going to be dust. And this was a life cast made from the real man in in the 1880s, whenever it really happened. And it was sitting on a shelf in the London Hospital Museum behind glass. And David and I said, well, yeah, we'll try. And we went to the museum, and Percy Nunn was the name of the guy who was the curator of the museum. And he'd been there for like 30 years. And when we first met him, he was very, very dismissive. He didn't like the idea that we were making a movie about this man who he felt he knew. And anyway, we go there after we had talked to Chris, and we asked, we said, look, would it be possible for us to borrow the cast? I'm absolutely certain that he was going to say no. And he was remarkably kind, and he said, all right, he let us do it. I mean, I was scared to death that we had to have grips and people come and take it, and I was so afraid that something might happen to it. And what was amazing about it is that it when I say it's a life cast, I mean, literally there were whiskers still in the plaster. I mean, it was the plaster taken from the man at his death. So, and there are pictures of it, which are in my book, but in other places too, where you see it on the table in Chris's workshop next to the clay model that Chris had of John Hurt's head, and then he built out from John's head something that very, very closely matched what the real man looked like. And he had the Elephant Man in his workshop the entire time he was designing the makeup, and we got it back to the hospital and everything went fine. But, it's one of those lucky things. I absolutely do, and I think that certainly, from my point of view anyway, I don't think this was a man who was on exhibit his entire life. Obviously, from what we know, and you probably know maybe even more than I do about it, he was, he consented to it. It was part of how he had to live. On the other hand, at this stage, I would certainly be for his bones having a proper burial. I think we have pictures of them. I think we have, for anything needed for anybody's research, I don't think the real bones would be meaningful, and I think it would be absolutely the right thing to do. The fact that they do have the cast of the life cast is still there, as far as I know, and also the kind of cardboard cathedral that he made was also at the hospital. So I can't see any good reason not to grant him a proper burial now that we know enough to be able to make that happen. Sure.